welcome to New York City Atheists live on tape, brought to you by New York City Atheists Incorporated. I am your host, Dennis Forbitz, David Letterman of the Hopelessly Damned, and I approve this message. The last time we had our guest, Dr. Peter BRANCAZIO, we just didn't have enough time to get in all the question and answers, and in fact all of the lecture that he had prepared. So basically what we covered was the Old Testament, and I think this time we're going to be picking up where he left off, dealing with the New Testament, and it's, I guess it's getting its inspiration from the Old Testament. But if I can just take a second and put in a plug, this is why if you're watching the show you should get involved, because we get so many people down here, and people, we have such interesting guests, and people start asking questions, and we don't have enough time to get all the stuff into one show, so we've got to kind of do more than one show for each subject and guest. And in any case, I just want to give you a little background before I introduce him. And we have members of we have independent reporters here tonight, and apparently we also have the police after us too. So, but as such, our guest is wired like a Christmas tree and set to go off. So. But I just want to give you a little bit of background for those one or two of you who didn't watch the last show. Dr. BRANCAZIO was chosen by Newsday as one of 6 great teachers in New York in 1990. He taught for 35 years in the physics department at Brooklyn College. He created and taught for 7 years a now famous course called Science and Religion, inspired by a grant from the famous Templeton Foundation. He is the author of the book, The Bible from Cover to Cover, which I am now about halfway through and totally recommend. I don't know if we can get a close-up, Joe. We'll try to get a swoop. Sorry if we're making you dizzy out there in television land. I'm about halfway through this. It's a great book. I recommend it. And as I said to him before the show, I pay him the highest compliment I can pay any author. It is now splattered with steak sauce. So, without any further ado, I think we should just... Peter, come out.
Okay. Throwing it in your face. Beware of practicing your piety before others in order to be seen by them, for then you have no reward. So whenever you give alms, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so that they may be praised by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward. But when you give alms, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your alms may be done in secret. Everybody should give money anonymously. Right? And whenever you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, so that they may be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward. But whenever you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Then he says something which is quite fascinating. Therefore, I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you of not more value than they? And can any of you, by worrying, add a single hour to the span of your life? And why do you worry about clothing? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not clothed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? Therefore do not worry, saying, what will we eat, what will we drink, or what will we wear? Right? Strive first for the kingdom of God and righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Ask, and it will be given you. Search, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened for you. For everyone who asks receives, and everyone who searches finds, and for everyone who knocks, the door will be opened. Finally, he says, in everything, do to others as you would have them do to you, for this is the law and the prophets. That, of course, is the golden rule, but this is the first statement of the golden rule, which is a positive statement. In other words, up to this time, people said, do not do to others what you don't want done to you. But this is more positive. This is proactive. Do to others what you'd like to have done to you. So this is the statement. Now, if there was no Jesus, somebody had to say this. And whoever it was is a pretty interesting philosopher. But the thing to remember about Jesus, the real Jesus, was that he was an apocalyptic preacher. He was a Jew his entire life. He was preaching to his own people. He says at one point, "Do not cast your pearls before swine," meaning do not teach to non-Jews, he tells his apostles. And what he was, as I said, as an apocalyptic preacher, he believed that the world was going to end in his own time. So was Paul, an apocalyptic preacher, who believed that the world was going to end in his own generation. Well, they were both dead wrong. We're still here. But given that, this is a way of understanding what he's saying, because he is telling people, don't worry about details, because the world is going to end soon, and what you have to do is to get yourself right with God. Right? So anyway, it's kind of interesting to read this, because this is a very unique philosophy, a way of life. It's very impractical, but nevertheless, there it is. And to say that this was invented by a committee, or that it was put together in terms of an unreal person, it's sort of the same idea with, people say, well, Shakespeare didn't write his plays. Well, somebody wrote them. And if he didn't want to call himself, if he wants to call himself Shakespeare, that's his business, But these particular statements, which apparently were taken down by someone and written down as the sayings of Jesus, which no longer exists in print, it's gone. Nevertheless, that's what Matthew and Luke had available and put into their works. And Mark didn't have it available. Okay. Now, the fourth gospel, John, is so totally different from the other three. And it's quite fascinating to read that, because the Jesus of the first three gospels is a human being who has been picked by God to do his work. He's divine. He's chosen, so to speak. The Jesus of John is a completely different character. He is God come down to earth. He speaks in very lofty terms. He's constantly referring to himself. I am the bread and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. There's about 15 of these I am statements through here. None of these are found in the other three Gospels. Some interesting differences between the three that are worth looking at. When Jesus is about to be arrested, this is after the Last Supper. Now, this is the story as it's told, and this is right after he has the Last Supper, and it says, this is in Mark. He says, they went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. He took with him Peter and James and John and began to be distressed and agitated. And he said to them, I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and keep awake. And going a little farther, he threw himself on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. He said, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I want, but what you want. Now, think about this. Who was there to take this down? Okay? This is Mark's literary invention. He creates the story, and it's quite fascinating because it's a Jesus who is agitated. He is upset. And then later on, in the same book, when he's on the cross, his last words are, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's not found in the other Gospels. Right? So Mark creates a Jesus who is uncertain about what he's done. And it's, although he is subjected to physical punishment, physical suffering, the mental suffering that he experiences in the story as it's told, when he finds that his apostles, who have never understood what he had to say, have abandoned him, and his God has abandoned him. He asks God for help, and he hears nothing from him. So it's quite fascinating. Why did Mark write it that way? And this is one of the mysteries. In the end, after Jesus is dead and his disciples find the empty tomb, Mark simply ends at that point. The tomb is empty. The women walk away. There is no resurrection scene. Jesus does not appear. Now, people were so disturbed. The early scholars were so disturbed by this that several years later they added a passage to Mark. There's a whole section of Mark that was tacked onto it where Jesus appears before his apostles. And this was not known until people discovered the oldest manuscripts of Mark, where this resurrection is not in there. So it's really difficult to understand what this author was up to. What was he trying to say about Jesus? I get all of these guys confused. This is Mark. Yeah, okay. So Mark presents Jesus in a very particular way. Jesus is a faith healer. He is a preacher who gets people to follow him wherever he goes. He's obviously a very magnetic person. And he's telling people, prepare for the end. The end is at hand. The world is going to end soon. Be ready for it. And then in the end of the story, he has these tremendous doubts. Okay? Now, when you read the other Gospels, he has no doubts about what his role is. Now, Matthew copies right out of Mark. I mean, Matthew's version of the story is identical to Mark's version. He just copied. He didn't waste any time changing stuff around. Luke tells the same story. He came out and was accustomed to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. When he reached the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not come into the time of trial." Then he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." When he got up from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. Again, no one was there to record this. And if the Bible is inerrant, why don't these two stories agree with each other? Here, Jesus is not as upset as he was in Mark. He simply kneels down and prays. He doesn't throw himself down on the ground in anguish. Okay? In fact, what people did, and one of the things that we know is that people who copied the Gospels added material as they saw fit. Okay? We don't have the original, and there are sentences in here that were added 50 years later, 100 years later, 8 centuries later. Okay? Someone stuck in this sentence. Then an angel from heaven appeared to him and gave him strength. In his anguish he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down on the ground. So Luke's picture of Jesus is that he is so calm that he's not perturbed enough. So he has him sweating drops of blood and has an angel come to help him. Okay? Again, this is no eyewitness story. This is a literary creation. Right? And so the same thing. John has a totally different story. And in John's story, there is no agony in the garden. John's version of Jesus is that he is so confident that he is going through what he knows he has to do. He is a God come down to earth, takes on human form, and demonstrates to the people around him what they have to do to return to heaven with him. So we have actually, Matthew is so close to Mark that you don't think of them as any different. But we have, say, Mark, Luke, and John, 3 different versions of the same story. Okay? And again, if you want to take the trouble to read through the Gospels, you will find all of these points of contradiction coupled with direct copying of the text. So you'll find word-for-word passages and then these interesting little divisions. In Mark, Jesus' last words are, my God, why have you forsaken me? In Luke, Jesus says, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. This is the sort of thing you say when you've been hanging on a cross, dripping blood for 3 hours. And in John, he simply says, it is finished. So I think I said this last time, but it's still a worthwhile question to ask your religious friends. Question, what were the last words that Jesus said on the cross? And you can even give them a choice, multiple choice. So why don't these agree with each other? Why, if the Bible is infallible, why are these stories so different from one another? Right, that's the interesting thing. Okay, let me say a little bit about Paul. Now, Paul is a very important figure in Christianity. He was not the inventor of Christianity. He was not the founder of Christianity. He was lucky because his letters were preserved and others weren't. When Paul went around, and what his letters reveal are his personal comments on his troubles going around from congregation to congregation, going from town to town, and he went to various places. He went to Corinth, he went to Ephesus, he went to all of these places, mostly in Greece and Turkey, to set up Christian communities. So he would go there. he would work. He was a tent maker. So he would set up in the community, he would work as a tent maker, and then he would preach to people around him and slowly gather a congregation. Now, Paul's congregations were tops 50, 100 people at most. They were very, very small. They met in the houses of say, some of the wealthier, apparently a lot of wealthy women were attracted to his teachings. And so they would allow meetings in their houses. But when you read his letters, you find out that he was subject to a lot of criticism from other Christians, from other missionaries. So you find that he would go into a town, he would preach, and then after he left, a bunch of missionaries from some other Christian group would come in and say, that guy that was here last week, he's out of his mind, don't listen to him. And then he would have to write a letter back to the original community saying, don't listen to those guys, they're crazy. So when you read between the lines, you recognize that there were multiple versions of Christianity in the first 100 years, 200 years or so. There were many different versions, one of which were the Ebionites, who were Jewish Christians. Christianity really started out as a sect of Judaism. As I said, these are Jews who believed that Jesus was the Messiah. And so they believed that if you wanted to be a Christian, you had to be a Jew first, which meant that you had to follow the dietary laws, that you had to keep kosher, you had to follow the dietary laws, you had to practice all the rituals, and the men had to be circumcised. So this was a problem for Paul. Paul wanted to preach to the Gentiles. And so he would go to a Gentile community, or he would call a meeting, and Gentiles would come to the meeting, as they very often did. And he would have to tell them, well, if you want to become a Christian, you have to get circumcised. Now, that would turn any guy off. And so he went back to the leadership. And the leadership was led by Jesus' brother. And this is one of the few pieces of evidence, written evidence, where both Paul and Josephus refer to James, the brother of Jesus. So James was the leader who took over after Jesus died, and he was in Jerusalem with all the Jewish Christians. Right? And so Paul went back to Jerusalem, and he asked for permission to say, well, if you're Jewish, you have to follow the Jewish law, but if you're Gentile, you don't. So that now Gentiles could become Christians without having to be circumcised, without having to follow the dietary laws. Well, that was a really smart move, because at that point, he then began to collect Gentiles into the Christian community. And it was within about 30 or 40 years that there were more Gentiles than Jews. Now, one of the things you find in the New Testament is a very anti-Jewish tone to it. And what's happening, what that reflects is that a lot of Jewish people did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah. So they turned them down. Now, they were perfectly within their rights, because the Jewish concept of the Messiah was a man, a powerful leader, who was going to lead them in a rebellion against Rome. And so here comes this fellow comes down from Galilee, walks into town, does something or other, and before you know it, he's hanging from a cross and he's dead. That was not what the Jewish Messiah was going to be like. And so it was perfectly reasonable why they didn't accept him as their Messiah. But eventually, what would happen in these congregations, which were half Gentile and half Jewish, is that the less and less Jews were willing to accept this idea of Jesus as the Messiah. And so, as I said, Christianity became more and more Gentile. But Paul's major contribution was the idea of saying that you didn't have to obey the Jewish law. And obviously, if you tell people, well, you don't have to be circumcised to join this organization, that's a good way to bring them in. And it worked very well for him. But he did not find, when he went around, his years were maybe from 20 to 30 years after Jesus died. And he traveled around the Mediterranean, the Eastern Mediterranean. And it's kind of interesting. He started out in Jerusalem, and he ended up in Corinth, which is in Greece. Now, how did he get there from Jerusalem to Corinth? He walked. Right? This was the way that they traveled. They simply walked from place to place. You could do maybe 15, 20 miles a day. And so he would spend months getting from one town to another. It was a very, very difficult way to travel. You say, well, why don't you go by boat? Well, the Mediterranean was a very dangerous place most of the time. In other words, you could get into storms, you get into shipwrecks. During the winter, you simply could not sail. There may be about 3 or 4 months that you could sail. During the winter, the passes, the mountain passes, were filled with snow, so you couldn't really travel during that time. And then when you went on the roads, there were people all over the place. There were pirates all over the place who would just simply stop you and take your money. One of the interesting things is that Paul took up a collection of money to bring back to Jerusalem. Now, he's got all of this stuff in Roman coins, and he's got to carry it with him physically back to Jerusalem from Greece. All right? It's a lucky thing he survived. Basically, what they did was they would sew the money into their clothing. And just because, if you went to an inn, you slept in a room with 7 or 8 other people. And any one of them could just, slit his throat and take whatever he had. So he had a very, very difficult life. But he was not the founder of Christianity by any means. There were other people who preceded him. There was a large Christian community in Rome which developed fairly early. Paul did not form that. He never went to Rome until much, much later. So that was not his community. There were Christian communities in Ephesus, Alexandria, and Egypt that were not founded by Paul. So who founded these communities? We don't know. Why? Because their writings were not preserved. Okay? So as I said, Paul is lucky. He had followers who took his letters, obviously a very, very small fraction of his letters, because only 7 or 8 of them survived. And these became part of the New Testament. And modern Christians read this as if this was the only thing that Paul ever taught or that Paul ever said, and that this was somehow divinely inspired. Right? So history was very kind to him, but his life was very, very difficult as a missionary who was constantly being chased and badgered by traveling gangs of missionaries who would go around teaching the other versions of Christianity. One was that you had to be Jewish to be a Christian. The other was what is called, can't say this on a dry mouth, Gnostic Christianity. The Gnostics were a group of people who predated Christianity, who basically believed that Jesus was an illusion, that he was a spirit who occupied a human body, and before he was crucified, the spirit left his body. The Gnostics believed that that souls were trapped in human bodies, and that if you had the proper knowledge, you could learn how to free yourself and return to the heaven where the spirits come from. And when they learned about Jesus, there were Gnostic Christians who said, Jesus provides us with this knowledge. So if you listen to Jesus, you will learn about this knowledge. Well, in 1945, an Arab young boy, a shepherd, discovered this jar out in the desert that was filled with texts. And these are the so-called Gnostic Gospels. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages. I think it's about 50 different books that were written by Gnostic Christians. And there are a whole bunch of Gospels in there that had never been seen before. There's a Gospel of Mary Magdalene, there's a Gospel of Philip, and most importantly, there's a Gospel of Thomas. And when we read these Gospels, these were Gospels that were circulated for many hundreds of years. But when Christianity finally became orthodox, in other words, one particular version of Christianity was settled upon, from that point on, all the other versions of Christianity were considered heresies. So it started out with many different forms of Christianity, about 4 or 5 different versions of Christianity. And they were competing with one another. And then what happened, a very strange story, the Emperor Constantine is about to go into a battle. He's going to try to enter Rome and overthrow the previous ruler of the city. And the story is told, now I don't know if it's a true story or not, that he sees the cross in the sky, which tells him, in this sign you will conquer. This sounds like a totally silly story to me, but nevertheless, this is what's come down to his history. So he has the soldiers put the cross on their uniforms, and they win the battle. Okay, so he then, eventually he became a Christian, but what he did was to end the persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire and essentially make Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. If he had lost this battle, I don't know, what would we all be by now, I guess? So, Gnostics, I guess. And so he then called a conference, a council, where they basically agreed that one particular version of Christianity would be the official Orthodox version. And from that point on, all the others were suppressed. We didn't know about any of these other Gospels until they were discovered back in the 1940s. So it gives a whole different picture of Christianity. One of the things that's interesting, there were two groups. One was called the Marcionite Christians, named for Marcion, who invented a version of Christianity on his own. He believed that there were two gods, that there was a god of the Jews who was vengeful, and there was a god that was represented by Jesus, and he was a kind, loving God. So there were two separate gods, and he basically said that we should stop worshiping the God of the Jews. And so he completely divorced Christianity from its Jewish roots. That's what he wanted to do. Okay? The Gnostics also believed in two gods. They believed that there was a higher God who was above it all, you know, totally ethereal and perfect and unchanging, all this stuff, and a lower God who was the creator of the world, which is imperfect. So the idea that there were two gods was something that lasted into about the 3rd or 4th century.